Hey everybody, this is Rydo and we're back to another live stream of video game news from Monday, November 4th, 2024. So I finished playing Torchlight 2 and so can't really recommend the game. It just has a little too many problems. I will say its New Game Plus works very well, and since you're only getting about 25 hours of gameplay in it, you probably should play the game a second time through to go from level 50 to level 100, which is about where you would be. But yeah, Path of Exile exists, Diablo Immortal on cell phones exists, Diablo 4 exists, Borderlands exists, which takes that looter dungeon crawler concept and makes it more of an open world first-person shooter concept, but you still have that same loot cycle, you still have skills, and you still have character classes. So there's just been a lot of evolution that Borderlands in particular did, which is kind of funny because Gearbox did something on Torchlight 2 and probably figured out some of what became Borderlands by working on Torchlight 2. But yeah, overall it's just kind of in the mushy middle. I don't think it's even better than the first game, and so overall skippable. Not awful, but just skippable. No real story to mention or care about. There are definitely some things in looter shooters or Diablo-like dungeon crawlers that still need to be evolved. It is crazy that there isn't a way to at least temporarily try a different character class. It is crazy that in 2024 you potentially have a completely different way in which you should play these kinds of games, in which you would play each character class up till, say, level 10 or so, just to see some of their skills, not really see all of their skills, to see if you would like it. Whereas, realistically, I would like more of just a nebulous level to be my progression in these games. If I'm at level 51, I'd like to be able to maybe spend a large amount of gold to buy a potion to just transition, for lack of a better term, into a different character class. I'd like to be able to try to be a mage at level 51. Potentially, I don't want to grind out at level 1 as a mage, because mages tend to be a little bit weaker. I'd rather be a powerhouse tough character at the beginning. Character classes in general maybe should just be out the door, and maybe all skills should just be available to all characters, and then you would build your own custom thing. These games, I'd like to see them drop significantly less vendor trash and instead have every single drop be potentially worthwhile. One thought certainly I had there is you could have a Tiny Pockets dungeon crawler where the second you pick up an item, you have to right then and there determine whether you're going to equip it and replace the item that you already have, or dismantle it into some kind of currency just then and there. Dismantling things immediately from your inventory instead of having to go back to a shopkeeper to sell it for gold is another evolution that really should happen. Even if dismantling it led to a more complicated system of, say, alchemy, where you got earth and water and air and mercury elements out of the weapons that you dismantled, and then you would have to transmute and alchemize new weapons from those currencies, or you would use those currencies to upgrade your weapon. There is certainly a thought too that maybe games like this should just be you have your starting weapon, and then when you get a new weapon, you very quickly have to decide whether you're going to swap to that new weapon because that's a better starting point, or you're going to dismantle that new weapon and feed some experience points into your current weapon, and that you would just constantly level up your weapon. Because in these kinds of loot drop mechanics, you're constantly getting something that's like level 25 but it's perhaps a unique level or a legendary level 25, and then the numbers are just going to stay the numbers. So you may get like a 1% magic item drop, which really magic item drop is always the thing you're looking for if you can increase that, because you're only looking for more magic items, probably to just get a new magic item that would have a 2% magic item drop. It's a system that just feeds into itself, but you just don't care about items that don't have enchantments or magical elements to them that would change your stats. But that 1% magic item drop never goes up, where it might be nicer if you took a different weapon and you could put another 1% of magic item drop, and then the numbers could just go up, since the whole systems are just based around numbers going up anyways. The biggest problem though with Torchlight 2 is certainly that it is just really bad on the procedural generation of the world, which I started a new character, I started a new game plus the world. In the above world, which there's a lot of above world in Torchlight 2, very few dungeons, unlike Torchlight 1, which had like 50 levels of one dungeon. Torchlight 2 goes to 7 levels at the end, at least playing on very easy. Also, it's certainly annoying in all games when you beat a game on easy and then it gives you a new game plus, you can't then elevate your difficulty at that point to a higher level. So you would just have to start a whole new character to play on Elite, and I did play on Elite very briefly, and yeah, it certainly would be a grind. It would probably take twice as long at least to beat the game on the highest difficulty, and that's ignoring hardcore mode, which I can't recommend hardcore mode for anybody, because there's at least one cheap death that I had even playing on easy, and overall I had like 6 deaths. But then the vast majority of the rest of the time, I was not even really taking damage. I had gotten my armor so high that even very large, unique boss characters often could not do any damage to me. And I'd just broken the balance there. But yeah, the procedurally generated worlds were just awful. Very stringy is how I described it. So you would have a starting place that would then go off far into one corner, way too far into one corner, and then you'd hit a dead end, and then you'd have to come back from that string, that tentacle, to the first fork in the road, and then you'd go off into another corner and hit a dead end, and then you'd have to come back, and then you'd have to come back. And it's just a matter of, when the world was procedurally generated, it would have made a lot more sense to close off a lot of the gaps and just have a bigger central open field in the middle of almost all the overworld maps. There's very little you do in the overworld maps except for grind out and kill the same old enemies. There are item sets in Torchlight 2, but the one set I really wanted, I never found enough pieces to actually wear it. You would need 7 pieces of the set, and there are 10 pieces of armor you can equip in total, and there's at most 4 weapons you can equip that won't be part of sets, which is too many pieces of armor, frankly, to have 10 of them, since most of them are pointless and just add to your armor stats. It's just an excuse to have more loot garbage and vendor trash. Certainly in more modern games you might have more than 32 spots of inventory to hold, which is far too little. And the main sales point, well, the 2 main sales points of Torchlight 1 was that you had a pet that would let you send loot back to the store and sell it, which really doesn't solve the problem of you getting too much garbage vendor trash loot. And it was a game with guns, whereas Diablo 1 and Diablo 2 don't really have guns. That is not improved upon in any way in Torchlight 2, and I played the entire game without ever picking up or using. Well, I picked up guns, but I never used them because there was nothing really special about them. I'm trying to figure out what the green number here is, but I'm not sure. It might be the people online right now. Noticeably, Monster Hunter Wilds has a beta test that happened. Maybe it's followers. And 142,000 people played in the last 24 hours. 463 people have played. Monster Hunter Wilds has a high chance of being a big ticket game, and even its beta making it to the 10th spot certainly highlights that. So we're seeing some bigger movement there, and that is the kind of movement that we'll see looking on SteamDB's chart versus my longer perspective chart, which won't ever have a beta test in it, I imagine, because the beta test would get relabeled after a week or two to just the game when it comes out, assuming it is coming out. Monster Hunter World very possibly also getting a boost. And see, Monster Hunter is also one of these games that I feel like Diablo 1 and 2 established as a foundation of what eventually evolved into it. The idea of Monster Hunter, I think, more is to randomly grind and continuously play forever to get monster parts to kind of increase your weapons and such. The danger I would be afraid of as far as the Monster Hunter universe is that there might just not be any into it, no clear story where things wrap up, and it might also be a little bit more multiplayer, or at least multiple characters cooperating, than I would prefer. It is also worth pointing out the negative aspect of how a lot of games have evolved from Diablo 1 and Diablo 2, in that there were true expansions in at least Diablo 2 that were full on install this new CD and you get a whole nother act, you get new characters, you get new content, whereas season passes these days tend to barely give you any real content of any note, and DLC has very much leaned into being greedy and minimalistic instead of giving you a whole another 60 hours of gameplay. It is also kind of annoying that in Torchlight 2 you never actually go to Torchlight, so you see it in a cutscene at the beginning of the game, but that's it. You just can't relive the same area with potentially maybe better items or new enemies, things like that, which that would have worked for Torchlight 1 as far as the way I remember it. It really would have worked if post-game you could have just gone through the entire 50 plus levels, floors in Torchlight with new randomly generated levels. There is a thing called the map works that you unlock at the very end of the game after you've beaten the final boss that lets you select certain maps and just go into randomly generated floors with different bonuses, so you can play forever in the map works, but there's no story connected to it, and it just doesn't look as good. And that is a problem in general, is that most of these sequel games have given up the idea of, hey, let's integrate our new stuff with the old stuff. Call of Duty is one of the few people that sort of does that. They bring back the same maps over and over again, but that's about it. And then you have games like Elden Ring and Dark Souls, Demon Souls that evolved a lot of the ideas of Diablo into being more of a first-person thing. But Elden Ring and those type of games also elevate the story quite a bit and give you specific bosses that might very well drop specific items, making everything feel way more important. But also with that, there is just a higher level of difficulty and just like a completely different style of control. One of the things I was thinking about as far as Torchlight 2 is that, and I guess I'm just doing a full review here. One of the things I was thinking about Torchlight 2 is that it probably could be resold and remastered on something like for the Steam Deck, although it may not really need any remastering to be playable on the Steam Deck right now. Whereas Elden Ring, it's a bit tougher to say you're going to have a great experience playing Elden Ring on a Steam Deck. You just don't have that smaller resolution cartoony art style that Torchlight 2 has, that is less demanding in Elden Ring. So the graphics are more demanding, the perspective is demanding of a larger screen, the controls need to be a little bit better. One of the irritating things about Torchlight 2 is it also does not have controller support at all, so it's just mouse and keyboard. And I think at this point we can say very few games on Steam should be mouse and keyboard exclusively. There's some styles of games that make sense for to still be mouse and keyboard, but almost everything should have a backup controller support. That would have been easier on my fingers. I could definitely feel after even 25 hours that I had just clicked with my pointer finger the mouse button far too much. I will also mention as a side note here that so far so good on new video settings as far as drop frames. I looked at the last live stream and the quality of the graphics was pretty bad, so I'm going to try and push the quality up as much as possible under this new kilobits per second limit. It says I'm sending like 600 kilobits per second, which seems to me to be a really small amount of kilobits per second, but I also am sitting on a stationary image that's only changing where the mouse is moving for most frames, so yeah, I could see it not really needing that much. So yeah, I'm now done with Torchlight 2. I need to just start scheduling videos. I'm thinking maybe ASAP. I mean, it really isn't too late to start having things air in November, and like, yeah, I could also just start in December 1st if I wanted to, but I'm not doing my channel any favors. We can see Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel is down to level number 91 on the chart. Is there anything that is making bigger swings? Still got clickers, even also ran clickers like Cats is still in the top 100. I do think a sci-fi cyberpunk looter game would make some sense too, instead of always falling into more medieval fantasy. Yeah, and there's a big problem with Torchlight 2 and Torchlight 1 in particular, is that it is just an also-ran as far as its visuals. It's not as dark as Diablo. You're not fighting demons as the final boss, you're fighting nether creatures that are more Cthulhu-esque but still very cartoony. So, yeah, it's not hyper-realistic graphics, it's not as dark. It looks kid-friendly, but in Torchlight 2, one of the first races you run into And before you even run into the first race and start a game, one of the character classes that you run into, as far as what you can play on as, has just suspenders over her the female body form just has suspenders over her nipples. And so, like, there's just this kind of lewdness to it. And then one of the first races has several characters that are kind of randomly generated, where the females barely have a strip of cloth over their nipples. It's just nearly topless characters. But then there's no other lewdness and no sexuality and no talk, even suggestive dialogue in the game. So you just kind of had a rogue artist, I guess. Which, heck, if you wanted to make an adult game that was like Diablo, by all means, and I'm sure there probably are mods out there to achieve that, but you kind of have to go all the way there. And certainly that undercuts the cartooniness of Torchlight, which Torchlight definitely looks like a game that should just be on the Switch as far as the type of game. It is kind of crazy that Nintendo hasn't made a Diablo-like game, and I guess they probably just haven't twisted their mind around how do you squeeze a Nintendo character into that universe without it being a case of you just killing things non-stop. How do you Splatoonify it, as it were? But I definitely think you could do that. You can have Mario in running around killing Goombas. It probably would make more sense to have Metroid, Samus Aran, running around shooting creatures instead. And yeah, getting away from the Metroidvania style of gameplay with Samus Aran would be an odd spin-off game, but it would be an interesting experiment. And certainly, like Splatoon, they could have just created a whole new group of characters for a whole new series. You could have Zelda, Link and Zelda, running around killing creatures, and that would get back to the fantasy thought. But it perhaps fights directly against Nintendo's impulse to make a game that kids could play for that long and just play over multiple times. They probably would be afraid of hurting their own sales in that case. Anyways, I've talked about Torchlight 2 more than enough for what was supposed to be me jumping into the video game news very quickly. So yeah, I'm still just mentally completely incapable of jumping into the beginning of these streams without rambling and doing a warm-up. I really just need to label the pre-show. Maybe I should just pick a time too. Like I am noticing that, like, it is roughly on the hour that I'm stopping my ramble here. So if I simply said the pre-show is going to go on until this point and then I'll have a hard cutoff, that would be a little awkward. But I could say at about this point we'll start to actually go through more news. Of course, I'd have to ramble kind of consistently without saying anything else, and I am a little too ADD in that I bounce around on topics sometimes. So the longer view chart will never change greatly, but we can see here that the Monster Hunter World game is in the list, but Monster Hunter Wilds beta test is not. And to get onto the list, the beta would have to get over 2,286 points, with the maximum it could get being 100 points per Monday, Wednesday, and Friday when this macro samples, if it was in the #1 spot. So it basically have to be in the #1 spot for 22 sample days. So yeah, basically I guess that'd be 9 weeks. And that does highlight an issue, certainly, is that this number is going to keep going up until I have an entire year's of sample, and then I start dropping sample days that are over 365 days, which I think I programmed it to automatically do that. So the totality of this number is that somewhere around 5,200 points should be the maximum, because that would be 52 weeks if it was in the first spot every single sample. No, not 5,200, it would be 5,200 times 3, so 150,600, or 15,600, yeah, is the maximum. And we just haven't been sampling for a whole year, so those numbers, that's the theoretical maximum there. And I don't think that theoretical maximum number actually helps me any. Right now it is still very relative in that either real people or bots are playing Counter-Strike 2 way more than anything else, and that once Home and Stardew Valley and Baldur's Gate 3 and Deadlock and Call of Duty are perhaps the more relevant things to talk about, and everything from this point over should just be ignored because these are locked in. Even Banana at this point feels like a locked in game that will always be at the top of the charts. Yeah, I definitely feel like if you were going to do an interview review, you could quickly glaze over everything here as just the same old games and go into deeper depth as to why is Stardew Valley still being played, or talk about newer games like Baldur's Gate 3 and Once Human, which I think actually came out this year. The Steam 3D sale ends now? Is it even still going? Yeah. Apparently it ends very quickly here, like maybe in an hour or so. Yeah. And then we will probably have silence for a while. I'm always surprised to see when DC Universe Online is still around. So yeah, there'll be a week or two of no sales or no big sales, and then we will start to have bigger sales, I think, after that fact. And they've already announced the dates for like a November sale, and a December sale, and potentially a sale in between them. So it is going to be a tough Christmas season if you really were planning on buying video games. There is talk amongst computer people to potentially buy electronic components and build a new computer before the United States elections, because at least one of the candidates has talked about tariffs and putting massive tariffs on foreign-made electronics would potentially significantly increase the cost of buying components. Intel or NVIDIA seems to have already shipped in a lot of components and are just letting them letting video cards just sit in warehouses to avoid potential tariffs. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of electronics companies have done that, where they've had TSMC in Taiwan make chips and components, or make finalized products, all the way to finalized products made even in China, and then they're just letting them sit. I wouldn't be surprised if there are Nintendo consoles for their next consoles that potentially are sitting in warehouses under lock and key even right now. Of course, big corporations can pay for warehouse storage for components for months on end, whereas to just abruptly decide you're going to build a new computer is probably not financially feasible for most people. The AMD 9800X 3D CPU is an intriguing top-of-the-line CPU, certainly, to consider purchasing. Definitely, I would recommend at this point all AMD, a Radeon GPU and a AMD Ryzen CPU build. But the software is not quite there yet. Still, we don't have a Steam OS that can be installed on PC. We have similar OSs that can be installed on PC, such as Bakelite and what's the other one called? Bakelite is one of them that's probably the more popular. There's some other ones too. You could also install Ubuntu, KDK Kubuntu, the education version of Kubuntu, if you wanted to make it for kids, and that would be somewhat similar to the desktop experience on the Steam Deck, but it's just not going to have anything Ubuntu based. It's just not going to have the full built-in elements that SteamOS will have. Once again, we have a new and trending game. It's an adult content game, although not being hidden behind any warning screens. Yeah, as far as new things go, there is no big AA or AAA games to really talk about here. Maybe you might argue that Life is Strange Double Exposure is a AA game, and I guess technically you might call a remastered release of a game. That is an interesting thought. Certainly, should remastered be considered at the same production level of the original game? Because Shadows of the Damned originally probably was a AA game, but a remaster of it, probably more on the budget, was a single A experience. So that concept falls apart when you are talking about the budget of a game that was potentially developed 10 years ago or later, or are you talking about the budget that was spent, the minimal amount of budget that was probably spent to remaster something? And that's not saying anything really to the quality of Shadows of the Damned remastered. That's just in general questioning. I certainly still don't really love the more zoomed out perspectives. Very few games I feel like are doing anything that really needs that zoomed out perspective. We have some upcoming games that seem fairly popular. Yeah, but overall, nothing too new. And you always get that weird disassociation where sales are promoting somewhat old games a lot of times on Steam. instead of trying to promote the absolute brand new stuff, because there's usually not too much absolute brand new stuff. Here's that Death Note Killer Within, which, yeah, I think really is just a ripoff of something like Clue. I saw a YouTuber talk about several board games that do the concept of Clue a lot better, and it really just points out, as Clue is a pretty old game, that there's some major flaws by modern standards on the way that whole thing works, and how slow Clue can be. I also tried to play Dominion on my cell phone, and I've had to go through the tutorial, which it didn't throw me into a tutorial originally, to figure out how to play in the first place, and found Dominion as a tabletop game not particularly interesting. There's just not a lot of variety to what you're doing. You just go through turns. I am also still playing the Pokemon trading card game, which in reality there's very little. Nobody builds a tiny house that's that shape. That's not staying together on the road. And in reality, building a tiny house on a trailer takes a lot of extra consideration. I have seen people on YouTube start to do that, where you're building a tiny house on a trailer base, which makes it considerably cheaper than buying a van and trying to convert a van. Notice the ratio of size here too. This house is huge, way bigger than what it should be. This would be a huge oversized, over tall load. So there's definitely some lack of realism in this. But yeah, building on a trailer means you're starting with a relatively flimsy base, and you have to get all that steel in that construction and the balancing perfect. And a lot of the fat of the tiny house stuff is mostly fantasy or a nomadic lifestyle urge that people have, but very few people could actually live with. There are mobile homes that exist, so if you were financially just trying to save money, having a mobile home in a permanent mobile home park, while that may be getting more expensive these days as private equity has bought out control of a lot of mobile home parks, that still is a much more realistic thing. And then selling or buying another mobile home in a different place, if you wanted a vacation in a different area, makes more sense than trying to move a house. Houses inherently are not designed to move. Most people, if your permanent house moves, you're in big trouble. Foundation cracking, floors breaking. I can certainly speak to that at some level. Just the nightmare there. The problem I still run into, though, with thinking about playing Diablo 4 is that they have added that whole seasonality to it. Also, I know that at this point the story is just completely pointless in Diablo 4. I think Diablo 3 ruined any possibility of there being a story evolution to it that might make it more interesting. Whereas Diablo 2 had this whole the angels are coming feel to it. It kind of felt like Supernatural decades before Supernatural happened, where there would just be this metaphysical power creep, and you wouldn't just be fighting Diablo. That this would be you would be a warrior in this giant war, and angels would show up more often, and new demons might show up, and you just go to new lands, and kind of just doesn't happen. In fact, I think they kind of get away from that just by having a time jump go forward. They probably painted themselves into a corner storyline wise. But yeah, if it weren't for the fact that this DLC is mixed reviewed, and that there's just a huge amount of greed, and you can see that with purchasing in-game currency and having in-app purchases, which really ruined the whole experience. They have this whole Steam Deck top plate. I don't know if that's something Valve actually does or if this is something that they have added to their page. Description, I guess maybe it is something Valve does, because it's not in the about the game. But yeah, you've got skins getting promoted and armor bundles and just items. It's just everything that's awful about these kinds of games now. Yeah. And that seasons and events just ruins it. It really does. And that was introduced with Path of Exile, but the difference there is Path of Exile is a free-to-play game. It does have in-app purchases, and I do think that there might be a fairly high in-app purchase in the sense that you have to buy other characters. I don't think you have to buy other characters if your character dies. That would be kind of crazy, but I do think you have to buy secondary characters if once a character has gotten to a max level. And Path of Exile 2 looks very much like a Diablo clone, but it is worth pointing out that there was a long period in which Activision dropped the ball there, and it took them a very long time to make Diablo 3, and people weren't super happy about it coming to console and having controller support, and in general they just weren't particularly happy with the quality of Diablo 3. Then they announced, if I recall correctly, Diablo Immortal, which pissed off a lot of their remaining fandom, and that they were focusing their attention on making a mobile game instead of making a Diablo 4. And then it felt like about a year later they announced Diablo 4, and then several more years until it actually came out. So it was just too long of a period, and distance didn't make the hearts grow fonder in that case. Let's go through the Video Games Chronicle articles. PlayStation has confirmed a list of 55 games enhanced by the PS5 Pro. The upgraded PlayStation 5 console launches this week. DF Retro did a pretty pathetic and pointless unboxing of two PS5 Pros, and literally all they did is open the box. So they are certainly experimenting, I guess, with following pointless trends, although they're probably behind the times by quite a bit. This list of 55 games, I suspect, is a list of 55 games that the new people in charge of Sony Interactive Entertainment care about. And I wouldn't be surprised if the improvements here might be somewhat minimal, just potentially just recompiles with higher default settings. But yeah, I don't even know what enlisted is. It's definitely some pretty obvious ones like Spider-Man that you would want to use as system sellers. I wouldn't be surprised if this is also just the top 55 list of top sellers, and Sony just gave PS5 Pros development kits to the top 100 game developers and said, please remake your game and remaster it even more and give us a bigger build. I wouldn't be surprised if Sony even threw some money towards the developers to make a new build. But yeah, it's going to be incredibly difficult to argue that you really need a PS5 Pro if you have a PS5 already, particularly since There is no disk drive coming with it, and faceplates aren't compatible. Yeah. I have been seeing some sales for some cheaper, mostly Hisense 4K UHD monitors, TVs. So, yeah. Now, again, because of tariffs, might be a good excuse to buy some 4K monitors. But I also am personally trying to get something that would be very bright and very useful, very, very high quality. And I'm not sure you quite get that on any of the Cell products. A lot of TVs these days die in a year and a half, particularly if you're getting cheaper ones. And it finally has gotten to the point where I really would recommend buying a warranty on a TV, although who knows how much those warranties would even be honored as far as buying extended warranties from third parties. Moving on with the video game news. We really don't have that much news today anyways. New Xbox Game Pass titles for console, PC, and cloud have been dated. They include StarCraft, Microsoft Flight Simulator, and Goat Simulator Remastered. StarCraft Remastered and StarCraft 2 Campaign Collection for PC. Yeah. StarCraft is another game I've been thinking about playing relatively recently, and it is almost the exact opposite from Diablo-like games in that it is still that top-down perspective. You're still clicking a lot, but you're not picking up loot at all. You're mining resources to create more units, yes, but you're not picking up randomly generated loot. Most of what I recall of StarCraft were very much bespoke, artistically created maps, not procedurally generated maps. Maybe there was some random map feature in StarCraft, but it really wouldn't have been the focus of what you play on. You have to admit that the random generation of items very quickly went from, oh, this is a cool feature that CPUs are now powerful enough to do in Diablo 1 and Diablo 2, into here's a great way for us to be lazy and just make it seem like there's a sales pitch of 10,000 items being available, when in reality it's just maybe 100 to somewhere between 20 and 100 different types of items with random numbers added to their stats. Yeah. And yeah, that's not good. Just moving towards being lazy, which a lot of game development is moving towards being lazy, which also makes me afraid that we would see video games like Diablo ripoffs that claim they have AI involved in it. And since almost all of the content in procedurally generated dungeon crawlers is already being done by some procedure, it would take nothing to say that is AI and just rebrand AI there. And that wouldn't make a better game by any means. It would just be laziness, certainly. Like, the procedures that the programmers put in are where you're going to put in the limitation of something being developed and make it a better experience or not. In Torchlight 2, had there been better procedures in the floor design and the level design, it would have been a much better experience. And that's where you need game testers and experts to be able to tweak things, and not just AI who's going to throw random nonsense at you. Ubisoft's NFT RPG has reportedly been plagued by a single player auto-winning every game. Players are complaining that they currently play ranked battles as a result. So, sounds like one cheater has broken the entirety of the game. Um, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is a case where there are some bots that are winning, making those accounts more valuable, if they really ever would have value. They're saying this Polestar 111, also known sometimes as Schiller 11, was in the top rankings with over 56,000 matches played. Yeah. And certainly it is not good news when the only thing being talked about in your NFT RPG that you sneakily released with no real advertising is that the experience is bad. Ubisoft claims like they're trying to improve themselves and address concerns. Particularly, they've delayed the Assassin's Creed Shadow game to try to better address concerns about that game. But then maybe the horse had already left the barn on this project, and maybe they're just trying to see how much money they can get out of it before giving up on it and shutting down the whole thing. Or maybe Ubisoft is just kind of full of bull, and they're saying one thing to their shareholders about fixing their image problems, which have been pretty bad, while also doing things like this that are actively hurting their image. Silent Hill 2 player discovers a hidden message from the Bloober team that the Bloober team thought was too hard to find. The game's 26-part photo puzzle has been solved. So apparently there was 26 pieces to a photo puzzle in the game. I guess that would all be spoilers, so we won't go any further with that. You still are very much just in this kind of weird situation with Silent Hill 2, particularly now that Bloober team has indicated that they're not really interested in making a new Silent Hill game, or a Silent Hill 3 remake, or a Silent Hill 1 remake. So it is back in Konami's court as far as what they really could do with the Silent Hill series, and I don't really have any reason to have any faith in Konami doing anything with it. I imagine they're just going to let third-party developers finish the other couple of projects around Silent Hill, and then they'll leave it stagnant while focusing on Metal Gear Solid Delta. And then if Metal Gear Solid Delta fails, which it very possibly will, then they might come back and bounce back to Silent Hill. Konami definitely feels like they still just desperately trying to make money and don't have a real vision and don't really care what happens to their video games lineup. I wouldn't be surprised if Konami doesn't just jump on the bandwagon and try to sue some other company and try and get money that way instead of actually making games or even licensing out their game license to other people, which is really all they're doing. The Yakuza creator Nagoshi shares progress on his studio, posts music video of his face exploding. Nagoshi's studio celebrated its 3rd anniversary but still has yet to reveal its debut game. Now this is weird that the video here is a little bit off, but I guess that's because it's probably a video, so there's some room for tweaking. Still, I've done some tweaks. Okay, the Pokemon trading card game is currently earning 3 times more per day than Pokemon Go, estimates suggest. It's claimed that the new mobile game has made $12 million in its first 4 days. I think that is fairly believable considering how terrible and greedy the game actually is. There's very, very little you can do in the game other than open packs. Yeah, because if you don't have that initial burst, and it makes a very terrible onboarding experience, frankly, uh, because you don't have enough cards to really build a deck, and because you can't really build decks, you really can only go so far as playing in solo mode, and you really are only going to go a tiny bit of distance playing against other players who are probably paying tons of money to buy packs faster than the free-to-play players. There's just going to be a huge gap between free-to-play players and the whales of the Pokemon game. I wouldn't be surprised if this game manages to maintain a large amount of income, that we just start to see actual real-world Pokemon cards become rarer and rarer, that they would just disappear from the shelves of Walmart and Target. And at a certain point, I kind of feel like Walmart and Target might be very happy to remove card games from the shelves. There is also a controversy, once again, with Magic the Gathering, in that they have said more than half of their expansions are going to be licensed universe IPs for Magic the Gathering. So you're going to have characters like potentially Spider-Man, SpongeBob SquarePants, The Walking Dead. Just entire expansions are going to be that, instead of Magic the Gathering staying within its own art style and at some point celebrating artists, fantasy artists making custom art. And yeah, that whole Dungeons and Dragons fantasy concept is being abandoned. On top of which, the other half of the expansions that are still staying within the Magic the Gathering Dungeons and Dragons themes, a lot of those are joke spin-off version expansions too. So it's the characters from Magic the Gathering, but they're on motorcycles, or they're zombies, or they're wearing crazy hats. Things that still just doesn't have that level of seriousness. So it definitely feels like just all the seriousness of Magic the Gathering that's been established for decades is being thrown out of the window in favor of more sales. And this is not what, like Secret Lair, where they were making a few My Little Pony cards and selling them directly as kind of collectibles. This is tournament legal expansions. So yeah, even if you don't buy the cards and you don't like them, if you're going to play Magic the Gathering tournaments, now you're going to see other people playing the cards, and that is weird to say the least. So yeah, I could see stores wanting to get rid of Magic the Gathering from the shelf, wanting to get rid of Pokemon, and just Wizards of the Coast in general wanting more direct sales and full profits from direct sales of shipping card packs and boxes through the mail instead of shipping them to stores. I imagine comic book stores would still have card packs all the time, and so I don't think we are anywhere close to the death of cardboard cards and real world cards, but I could see definitely the Pokemon Company trying to push new generations of players to play digitally only, but they really aren't making a great offering right now. Like, you should be able to, if you want to, jump into Pokemon the trading card game on your phone 3 or 4 times a day and find something fairly entertaining to do, and it's just not the case. You go into it once in the morning and you might have a card pull, and then 12 hours later you'll have another card pull. There might be a free Wonder Draw, which is another thing that it does, and they're doing a whole event around that that you can do once, I think, every 12 hours. So 2 kind of card pulls. Wonder Draws are more like a pick one card that's face down and hopefully it's the card you're looking for. but that's the main experience on Pokemon. There's just no reason to actually go into your decks. It takes about 5 clicks to actually even get into your deck and build a deck. There's no reason to look at your cards otherwise. It takes about 6 clicks to get to the point where you can actually play the card game. And the card game just has an auto mode where you can click auto and not even play it. And yeah, I've been jumping in at least once a day, probably twice a day, trying to play these solo modes and just have that full solo experience. Once I've done the full solo experience, I won't have any more rewards to grind out in solo, and I'll have to figure out if playing against other players might give me some kind of rewards. The daily rewards expect you to open 2 card packs and maybe play 1 game of Pokemon per day. It's just not really a great experience compared to the real world. There are no tournaments at the moment. I'm not even sure that there's more than the first expansion at the moment. I have, I think, somewhere around 190 to maybe 200 of 226 cards for the first expansion, and so that is your first free-to-play pop. But after that, without a new expansion, there's very little to do. Generally speaking, you also want to have enough hourglasses to open 10 packs at a time, and that's something that you probably would only be able to achieve every 3 or 4 days. I don't really have the audio on much, but I definitely don't, it doesn't feel like the cards are animating, playing sound effects of the Pokemon characters when you play it. So, but I do have the audio on. I do hear sound effects, but yeah, there's nothing special about playing the card game in a digital format when it really feels like it should. And the special animation that they advertised this game with, I think really only applies to 9 cards out of 226. So yeah, you definitely have a better experience still playing Pokemon Go. And there's probably a very direct inverse connection to how fun a game is and how much money is being spent on it. I could make the same argument with Memento Mori, which I'm still playing on my cell phone, in that it's not really a fun game. It's a game designed to play itself. You go through the grinding and the dailies. There's a heck of a lot more to do in Memento Mori every day than Pokemon, a trading card game. But yeah, since the game plays itself, there really isn't a lot of interaction and fun there. It is a management game more than anything, and with that, the amount of microtransactions are very high in Memento Mori, and Memento Mori is in about the top 20 of the last chart I saw as far as the amount of money they're making per month. So yeah, they're making a lot of money, certainly. Yeah, of course that's the problem with mobile games in general, is that it's all about the money and it's very much not about the quality. Let's see, let's move on from this grotesque imagery as fast as we can. Toyama says, like Silent Hill, Slitherhead will be rough around the edges. The Silent Hill creator's next game will be released this week. That certainly isn't a words of encouragement or a thing anybody wants to hear, that the game will be rough around the edges. In a lot of ways, also, this is him just potentially implying that it will never get improved. This isn't saying that day one may be a little rough, but we plan on fixing it. This is him saying we plan on releasing a rough around the edges game and it just staying that way, in the same way that Silent Hill, as a PlayStation 2 game, I think, was just released and then never really remastered or re-released in a way that would have fixed it. Yeah, I would. It is definitely much more of a comparison to say that the Resident Evil remakes and reboots have done a much better job of taking an older game like Resident Evil 1 and, well, in particular Resident Evil 2, and just made it a whole new thing that works for modern game design and much better experience instead of just trying to remaster it, which, yeah, remasters for such old games like Resident Evil 1 don't work beyond a certain level. Of course, there's no excuse for a brand new game to be rough around the edges. Like, that just diminishes confidence severely. The Final Fantasy producer claims Square plans to release the game simultaneously on Xbox going forward. Yoshida recently said he'd like to see Final Fantasy 16 on Xbox. There's no telling if that is accurate, because I feel like the Final Fantasy creators and anybody else working at Square Enix are always at risk of just being laid off at any point, just because Square Enix is unhappy and a bad management company as a publisher. Yeah. There is very little reason to not simultaneously release on the Xbox and the PlayStation at the same time, unless PlayStation is paying you, and it does seem to imply that PlayStation is no longer paying Square Enix for exclusivity deals. But yeah, it doesn't really hurt sales of the PlayStation much in Japan if Final Fantasy games are also released day one on Xbox in Japan. And so that's probably where PlayStation is mostly focused and concerned about. It would be much bigger news if he said that going forward, Square Enix plans to simultaneously release all games on the Nintendo consoles and the PlayStation. That would be a much bigger challenge, certainly. And yeah, we do still have this nebulous issue on what is an Xbox even going to be in the future, because there is a decent chance that what Microsoft calls an Xbox is just going to be an operating system or a platform that you install on PCs and ROG Allies and Linux installs, and like cell phones. Like, everything could be an Xbox is basically the idea that they're pushing, instead of there physically being an actual box. Apparently, League of Legends World tickets were taken from fans at the last minute and given to Linkin Park. Fans were allegedly told 90 minutes before the event. That's a major screw up, certainly, if that's true. Like, there's no way people who either purchased tickets or were given tickets should have them taken away at any point, whether 90 minutes before or 90 days before. On top of which, there's just no reason and no way that there shouldn't be a few reserved spots. Generally speaking, if there weren't any reserved spots, then you would have, like, Linkin Park be backstage or on the side of the stage watching, instead of putting them in an audience seat. Yeah, and just the security of that, having somewhat famous musicians in the audience with other people, seems really weird. Yeah, this would be a box that they would be in, which makes a little bit more sense. But is this really video game news, though? And frankly, I have to ask, is this really League of Legends? And I have to ask, is this really Linkin Park? I assume all of this is true, but I don't recognize Linkin Park. I don't recognize League of Legends. So, yeah. If you are a big famous group like Linkin Park, you could probably have found a box that would have taken you in and just sat with the fans, and then the fans would have been exhilarated to say, hey, we want to watch this too, can we hang with you? And certainly that's not good PR for Linkin Park. It's not good PR for League of Legends. Again, though, not really video game news. The Pokemon Scarlet and Violet TCG Prismatic Evolutions have been announced, so that sets focusing on Eevee and his evolutions. They definitely seem like they have lined up this new real world card expansion to launch in line with the trading card game, but weirdly it is not really being promoted so far in the trading card game. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the digital trading card game introduces this as its first major expansion and throws out the second oldest expansion, assuming that we've even touched upon the oldest expansion, which we may not have. But yeah, there's a big back catalog of trading card games that in some way you would like to get in the trading card game. Or at least I think there's a big back catalog. Otherwise, the entire Pokemon trading card game may be built on a deck of lies, a house of lies, of just the exact same cards being re-released with different artwork, which probably is somewhat the case. I wouldn't be surprised if there is like 20 different artworks for Misty and Ash Ketchum may be in the game. I'm not sure I've ever actually seen an Ash Ketchum character card, trainer card. I wouldn't be surprised if there's like 5 different Pikachu artworks. And that's what you would assume you would get with the different visual effects in Pokemon the trading card game, is that you would get variant art for the same cards, but it doesn't actually work that way. And that'll be its major step forward, certainly, as the digital card game, is that how is it going to handle new expansions, how is it going to handle going back to back catalog. It's already dropped the ball on one aspect, in that you probably could have given the first expansion for free, just a complete set of the first expansion to every single player. That way they would start with a lot of cards. You could have certainly given a starter bundle for free to everyone instead of more of a random selection of cards from opening card packs. Yeah. And that certainly hurts trying to do some of the solo gameplay challenges, as to win you kind of need certain cards, and you kind of need certain types of cards, like dark cards and light cards and metal cards, electricity cards, earth cards. If you get a random selection of cards and you don't have any electricity cards, it's going to be very difficult to beat the water challenge, the water decks. Let's see. Dragon Age the Veilguard tops the Steam charts, breaking BioWare's concurrent player record. EA's latest has knocked back Black Ops 6 off the #1 slot. Interesting. This is the top sellers chart, though. Not one we pay as much of attention to. And then that was older news anyways, and that's going to bring us to Gamatsu news, which it too does not feel like there was a lot of Gamatsu news over the weekend. It tends to be the case, though, that there isn't a lot of news over the weekend. And certainly in the United States, Super Tuesday, I think is what it's called, is tomorrow, is the election day, voting day. So the politics of the past few weeks may also have slowed down video game news somewhat. We have been very lucky, though, that none of my news sources have tried to do any kind of get out the vote movement at all. Which, had each of my news sources said, if you're in the United States, don't forget to vote, and maybe they will do that today or tomorrow, but that wouldn't have been too terrible. What would have been terrible certainly is if it had been weeks and weeks and weeks of political advertising. I doubt there would have been too much of that, because political ads in the United States still very much run by people who don't really target or know how to advertise to gamers or people on the internet in general. They're probably pouring a lot more advertising into targeted ads on Facebook than they would do as far as trying to advertise on YouTube. I think YouTube in specific said they weren't going to take any political advertisements after a certain point in the last 2 weeks of the election. But yeah, there isn't a super PAC out there that is going to try and put ads on video game websites as articles, as embedded ads, which would be the only thing I see, because I've got uBlock Origin and Firefox's own ad blocking, and I also have my router blocking ads via AdGuard Home. So if there were potentially banner ads on the side of these pages that were political, I wouldn't see them anyways. So yeah, I've curated the experience I definitely would want. And yeah, there are bigger things at stake, so from a video gamer perspective, the only thing that potentially would change a gamer's experience as far as playing video games would be, I guess, tariffs might raise the price of video games as far as software coming in, but maybe not. And that would be about it. And so yeah, there's nothing really to say there. We already talked about the over 50 enhanced games at launch. I wonder if the enhanced for the PS5 Pro is not much different than the enhanced for the PS5 versus PS4 games being enhanced. And certainly they're just going to lean on the enhanced key phrase too much, where there will be PS4 versions of games that will be enhanced to be PS5 versions of the games, and then there will be PS5 versions of the game that will also be enhanced to PS5 Pro versions of the game. I can't even say the sentence without getting it confused. Yeah. And I wouldn't be surprised if this is just them trying to establish a constant revenue source, and that they're trying to triple dip on PS4 owners by selling them the same game slightly enhanced 2 times over. Game Pass adds Metal Slug Tactics, Goat Simulator Remastered, and more in November. Actually, kind of a larger list than what we usually see. We usually only see 2 or 3 games being emphasized. That being said, Black Ops 6 would be the big sales point. And yeah, with the higher prices and the higher tier of Game Pass that you need to get everything, Xbox Game Pass doesn't feel particularly great these days. And in general, I just don't think that there is a good argument for Game Pass now. I'm not sure there ever was. Gamatsu has Death Note Killer Within How to Play trailer. I think we watched this, but this might have been a different trailer than that we watched. Certainly, Death Note Killer Within as a YouTube short will catch people's attention. Yeah, I need to schedule more YouTube shorts and I need to schedule videos, and so my hope is to really focus on that perhaps for a week here and just start getting things scheduled. Lords of the Fallen version 1.6 update is now available. Further performances and gameplay enhancements, PS5 Pro support, and more. I've heard of Lords of the Fallen, but I actually couldn't tell you what it's about. Noticeably, I tried to fix this where if something had a Steam link, it would have come out and been opened, but still not really happening. So I'm gonna have to do a deeper dive of figuring out what this is. Yeah, this game overall is still mixed reviewed, even though in the last 30 days it's at 76% positive. Definitely looks to me like a Dark Souls type game. The visuals are more grotesque and hyper realistic, which really shows a good comparison to just what Diablo 4 really is needed to be compared to. And I do think probably half of your Diablo fan base from decades past did evolve into wanting to play more of these kinds of first person experiences or third person experiences instead of top down experiences. Yeah. Arcs of Sharon launches November 7th. This also, I suspect, has a Steam link. Yeah. So I'm just gonna drag every page that has a Steam link to investigate further why that's not working. This week's Japanese game releases include the PS5 Pro, which is hardware, Slitterhead, Mario and Luigi Brothership, and more. Also River City Saga 3 Kingdoms, Next, Taikai no Tetsujin Rhythm Festival ports, and etc. Some of the reviews are coming in for Mario and Luigi Brothership. I haven't really heard much yet, but it does seem like on Metacritic it's getting about a 71. So not amazingly good, but average. Perhaps even a little low for a Nintendo game starring Mario and Luigi. There's quite a list here. And see, this is a question too, is why is the first game here not also being clicked on? Like, I literally have it so simple. It says it's any link that has the word Steam in it is supposed to be clicked on. So in this case, there should be something amongst here that says Steam. Here, this one here should have been clicked on, and yet I don't think it was. Unless it is just a case that all these links are being opened and then they're just getting moved to the very end. A game called Beastie Ball launches in early access on November 12th. A turn-based volleyball RPG will be playable from start to finish. Interesting, it looks somewhat kid-friendly. Let's see if we can maybe look at it a little bit. If the video will load. Yeah, I'm still at 0 drop frames. That being said, that didn't load. Yeah. And yeah, it definitely feels like there's room for more kid-friendly or sports-oriented games. Interesting. So I'll want to try and keep an eye out for this. It is on my follow list. Still don't really have a way to do any follow list cleanup. And then Venus Vacation Prism Dead or Alive Extreme added its last character, so this is older news in Nanami. Which one was Nanami? That's Masaki, that's Fiona, that's Elisa, Tamika. There's a re-release of a game, this is Nanami, that also is getting released in Japan and worldwide. One of the Japanese RPGs, I don't remember the name. But the re-release is using the censorship / edits of the Western version of the game, so there have been several stories, and sorry for not having the full details here, of this happening where retroactively and regressively even the Japanese versions of games are getting censored out of perhaps just sheer laziness of the Japanese developers and publishers when they want to release definitive editions and they just want to keep things consistently. I imagine that there's probably a lot of bug fixes that are applied to a Western version, particularly if a Western version is released later than the original Japanese version of Japanese games, and so it would be just too much of a hassle to put in all the bug fixes and then not take out all the censorship. I did look it up. The article says it is Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition is going to be based on the censored Western version. Now, I don't know really what the censorship there is. It may be a little. It tends to be a little. But any censorship is also bad in my book. Yeah. So, anyways, that'll bring me to the Gaming on Linux website, which I'm still trying to get a feel on what the interstitial would really say about Gaming on Linux, and so that's why there is no interstitial between it. Star Wars Bounty Hunter, High on Life, and more are going for cheap on the Fanatical bundle. I do think that there is also some time-saving metrics that I'm trying to implement. In particular, Video Games Chronicle, when they talk about their podcast, that's not an article I really want to click on. Same is true for Gaming on Linux. Yes, things going on sale and highlighting which of these games might be Steam Deck compatible or Linux compatible in general might be interesting, but it still feels too much like an ad, so I probably will try and eliminate things that say Fanatical bundle, things that say Humble bundle as far as articles go, because yeah, it's just not worth the extra time, and I don't want to become a walking commercial for sales. The Half-Life 3 fan game Project Borealis Prologue has gotten a Steam page and it's due out soon. This is more newsworthy, I would say. The thing here, I guess, is that Project Borealis is, I guess, probably trying to take that released to the public storyline that was written for Half-Life 3 by the writer that used to work for Valve and turn it into an actual fan project, since Valve is almost certainly uninterested in just making a traditional Half-Life 3 game because there isn't really any technical challenges there, as far as that really is just a teaser trailer, isn't it? Valve clearly is only interested in making games as an addendum to either a hardware or software technical challenge. So it's inspired by the epic cliffhanger from Half-Life 2 Episode 2. Project Borealis represents a fan-made effort to realize a cohesive story conclusion to the episodic series. The prologue chapter invites players back into HEV suit of Gordon Freeman, offering a glimpse into the next chapter of his journey. So this isn't really even Half-Life 3 as much as this is a attempt at Half-Life 2 Episode 3. Yeah. The thing I guess that might get Valve's attention is that if you could just make a Half-Life 3 that software-wise was very much more demanding and very much more challenging to do, just a whole new generation of graphics or audio or 3D rendering or giant level design, something like that. Physics is generally what the Half-Life games have always been about, is can you get that gravity gun style physics going. Portal is about can you create portals, and so very much physics in that case too. So there would have to be some new challenge that they were excited about finishing. This is interesting that there's a black bar at the top of it. Atari has acquired Transport Tycoon from Chris Sawyer. This is the new Atari acquiring, I guess, old games that may have been published by maybe it was published by Atari originally. OpenTTD also exists, which that's an interesting twist certainly, to have Gaming on Linux point out that there is an open source variant or clone of Transport Tycoon Deluxe, and so that is just a different thought certainly too. Yeah. That link brought me to another article talking about OpenTTD 14 bringing scalable fonts, new ship Pathfinder, social platforming integration. Being an open source game, though, I suspect it's not actually listed on Steam. And that is worth pointing out too, that there is still an aspect here where even Steam Direct for $100 is probably not worth it for open source software to be put on the Steam store page. OBS as open source software is on the Steam page, but that's kind of it. I would struggle to name even one open source game that is on Steam. RetroArch as an emulator is in some form on Steam, once again being software. Whereas I would imagine there's a lot of gamers out there that just want even open source games to be in their Steam library, and so I imagine there is probably a lot of gamers who would be willing to pay $100 to Steam to get the game listed, but then there would be a lot of work that the developer would have to do, and if the developer is not particularly interested in that experience, it's just not likely going to happen. And none of the open source games are that popular or that well known that they would actually get to the top of the sales charts or the download charts on Steam. Of course, with the Steam Deck, this might happen more often. We might start to see a lot more open source software getting listed on Steam, open source games in particular. Moving on, a new release of the Raspberry Pi OS has brought Wayland to all models with a new compositor, which I'm not sure how much that will improve performance, but it almost certainly will improve performance. The Raspberry Pi is still fairly weak as a single board computer compared to any other computer. It says it has significantly improved support for using the desktop with a touchscreen. Raspberry Pi also came out with a new touchscreen to replace their old touchscreen that they came out with, official touchscreen that they came out with, it seems like 4 or 5 years ago. It's still very hard though to justify getting a Raspberry Pi for anything right now, and there still really hasn't been a new RetroPie. Now that the official Raspberry Pi OS, which I believe is based on Debian, supports Wayland, there is an argument that RetroPie might go to Wayland compositing, but probably not, because RetroPie doesn't have a desktop in the first place. The only way RetroPie works is that all of that software is specifically built to directly composite without effectively a desktop mode or an operating system installed. It is doing it all directly for higher frame rates, more bare metal style of programming. You don't boot into a real desktop environment on RetroPie. You boot into a special build of an emulation station that is directly running a graphics driver and drawing the images. And when you launch into an emulator, that emulator is directly controlling the graphics. So it's very much more a DOS-like experience that's happening in the background versus a Windows-like experience. That removes a lot of overhead. Yeah, I definitely can't recommend Raspberry Pi for operating system, for computing, even for little kids. It's just not worth it now that the Steam Deck exists, and it probably wasn't even worth it when you could get cheap used laptops in the old days. Yeah, from my perspective, it feels like Raspberry Pi is struggling to find anything more it can do and anything more it can be. Yeah, if they came out with a Raspberry Pi 6 that was twice as powerful, then maybe that would change the calculation some more for emulation, but it would also raise the price twice as much. And at which point, if they were going to do that, Raspberry Pi should just come out with a full-on AMD 64x86 laptop and just use the Raspberry Pi brand to come out with a full new product that would be way more powerful and way more expensive. Moving on, KDE Plasma version 6.3 is going to show when apps are killed due to being out of memory, OOM errors, which you would have thought that would have been something built in as far as feedback by default. But I do recall that was one thing that KDE in their desktop environment was talking about, is that they wanted better messages and more messaging on errors. Of course, you never really should be planning or expecting to see errors as much as you should be planning on just not having errors in the first place. Steam Deck in particular might be somewhat memory limited. That being said, for the tiny amount of time I have spent on my Steam Deck, which I did get rid of my Nintendo Switch just because I wasn't playing it enough, and so now I'm down to one portable console, which is okay. For the tiny amount I've played with my Steam Deck, it doesn't feel like I've run out of memory, and I've had a ton of tabs open. So I don't know how many tabs you really would have to have open. Now you do close tabs on the version of KDE Plasma that SteamOS has when you reboot. Some of the tabs will reopen, but what's actually in the tabs and the applications are going to probably be closed. Chromium in particular has a bad habit of that, where every time I reboot, all the tabs or the Chromium is closed, and then I have to restore all the tabs when I relaunch it. And something in the new update has, or something in the settings I tweaked, has gotten the Steam Deck to be much better about going to hybrid sleep. So last time I went to my Steam Deck and looked at it, it had been in hybrid sleep mode or full sleep mode the whole time, and so it was at 70% battery life. Whereas previous times I've gone back after a week or two to my Steam Deck and found it at 0% battery, even though it is programmed to go to sleep and save the battery when nothing's happening. So that issue seems to have been fixed. I had several projects all over the place that I was working on with the Steam Deck and others, and all of those have just been abandoned due to this medium emergency that's plaguing my life at the moment and not likely to get any better. I literally have no extra time. I barely have enough time to even make YouTube content. And so, yeah. Some of that also is just I'm bad at finishing projects. I have to admit that too. I guess that is a valid question, certainly, to ask. If tariffs were to come, which is a big if, would the Steam Deck price be changed? Probably. The price of everything would probably go up, because the core components of the Steam Deck are going to be imported on a tariff. So even if the Steam Deck is assembled in the United States, the screens, the batteries, the buttons, the memory cards, the CPU and the GPU, all of that is from different countries, assuming it was just blanket tariffs on all other countries, all imports. But yeah, AMD is not an American company with an American factory assembling every single part in America. TSMC isn't even a chip factory that makes chips in the abstract. They only are able to make chips due to photolithography hardware that is made, I believe, in Germany. So there is just this whole global production stream, particularly of electronics and components, where bits of components come all over the place. Cobalt is coming through China, being mined out of Africa. Lithium is coming out of China probably too, as far as rare earth elements. Yeah, it would have been you really can't be isolationist and have a whole bunch of technology that the modern person expects. You can be isolationist if you want to go back to an agricultural lifestyle of 400 years ago. Certainly, I imagine the United States could grow its own food on the land mass it has, produce enough of its own energy, grow cotton and make its own clothes. That would require massive retraining of people and just massive constructions of factories, and that would take a long time. In general, I'm getting in too much of a political rant here, but I wouldn't be opposed to the slow turn up of tariffs by all countries so that they were more independent from each other. But it really is a very slow process you would have to do, and it has to be a very measured process, and that's not how tariffs usually are used. They're used far too quickly and usually far too punitively to punish another country, or to bribe another country, or to try and force another country into acting a different way. Whereas pure economic theory would make a lot more sense to ship less things overseas when they're not needed. I got a piece of furniture from China just about a week ago, and it's just like very weird to have flat packed assemble yourself furniture shipped all the way across the world, when trees and screws and steel, all of those things could have been made in North America, in the United States, but they aren't. It's also kind of interesting to get a piece of furniture that's going to be very big and have no one piece of it actually be even the full height of the cabinet, which is something they certainly are pushing for too, is that they don't want cabinets that have long pieces. The longer the piece, the higher the chance it's going to bend or snap in shipping. And so a lot of furniture is not being built the way a master craftsman might build it, but instead is being built to survive a UPS shipper throwing it around, or it being on a shipping crate being rolled around. Anyways, though, that has very little to do with video games, so let's move on. Let's see, you can check out Proton Seric if you have an older GPU for Windows games on Linux. Valve works with Proton to run Windows games on Linux is amazing, but they do require newer GPUs, so it has left some people behind, whereas a lot of people with Linux computers probably do have fairly old hardware. So then there's a community build of Proton, like G-Proton, that is specifically designed for GPUs that don't support Vulkan, which Vulkan is another video card driver, I think, or compatibility layer. Suffice it to say, I imagine this project is only for people who are more experimenting. The better solution would be to buy a newer GPU. It wouldn't even be the case that you have to buy a super powerful new GPU. I'm not sure what the newest Radeon right now is. I think a new Radeon may be coming out fairly soon. Anyways, but you know, you don't have to buy the top of the line newest to be able to support Vulkan. Certainly buy something that's 2 or 3 years old and you should be fine. Of course, a lot of people with Linux also have no interest in actually gaming, so this is a niche on a niche as far as a GitHub project. Let's see, Linux Mint has partnered up with Framework, also working on a nightlight for the Cinnamon desktop, which I would assume is like a desktop mode or something like that. I assume nightlight is a dark mode type feature and not some completely different application. It wouldn't be crazy for there to be an application called Nightlight that does like something different, like snapshots. I think Linux Mint was working on some new snapshot like backup type software. Snapshots aren't exactly backups. Linux Mint definitely seemed like for a while like it was going to be the Windows killer of operating systems, since its design was very much designed to make it look like a Windows-like operating system that would be very familiar to people who had used Windows 7 or Windows 8. This was certainly during the time of Windows 10's major changes coming out. now it's kind of harder to make an argument to use Linux Mint. You would use Linux Mint if you like Debian-based operating systems, but you don't like the ugliness of Debian, and you don't like Ubuntu because of how Ubuntu is run, or you don't like Ubuntu for some other reason. That would be your argument for Linux Mint, and it's a very good operating system from the amount I used it. But the fact that the Steam Deck uses Arch Linux and KDE definitely makes more of an argument to go that direction, because I think there is a higher chance that if anything is going to take market share away from Windows, it probably is going to be SteamOS, which Steam has gotten up to the 2% usage point on the Steam hardware user survey, so it is slowly crawling upward. 2% is a tiny amount, certainly, but it's still a lot. And yeah, it is definitely a hard thing. Like, the only way I can even move my own computer, which I'd love to experiment with this and do this, but the only way I could really move my computer to Linux is I've got to build a whole new computer, and then I need to wipe my old computer, install Linux on that once I have a new Linux built on my new computer, and then give away my current computer because it's too expensive and too new for me to do anything else with it. I could put it in a server case and have a third server that I've yet to set up and get working, but I don't need that. Like, the hardware is too new. It would make a lot more sense for me to give away the computer to somebody, or even try and sell it, which I probably never bothered to do. And so yeah, that's just a big ask to sell to give away $1,000 computer after and spend $1,500 potentially to build a new one. And it's not even worth like keeping the case. My computer CPU case is nice and all, but taking it all apart and keeping the case and putting my current computer in an older case is just a waste of effort. Instead, I would just buy the same case a second time. Yeah. Theoretically, I am certainly ignoring the fact that you could try and dual boot, but there's just such a high danger of messing up both your Linux install and your Windows install by dual booting that you take on a higher risk there if something goes wrong, or you just take on a higher risk that it just doesn't perform as well as you like. And me personally, I am kind of ready to get rid of my current computer because it just never really has performed particularly well. I'm not sure if the problem was a specific AMD CPU I got and it trying to overclock itself, or if it's my NVIDIA GPU, or if it's the motherboard or the RAM, who knows. But yeah, I've had long bouts of the computer trying to overclock itself. Now recently, I guess I've forced it to underclock itself well enough, and I haven't seen any major problems, but also playing Torchlight 2 isn't going to really push the graphics much, is it? Moving on, a game called Asylum. It finally has a release date of March 6, 2025. This looks like a horror game. Yeah. I don't think that there really is a way to curate the gaming on Linux promotion of games. And see, I want to scroll down here and see if, yeah, I would assume that they would only promote games that have SteamOS or Linux compatibility. Here you can see them mentioning Vulkan and OpenGL compatibility. And where on Linux they really want you to be, as far as Ubuntu 10.10 or later is the only version of Linux they're saying and a 2.4 gigahertz or higher video card, although they're not really saying how many cores, so theoretically you could have a 2-core 2.4 gigahertz and maybe this would work. Although in reality what they really want you to have is a 3.2 gigahertz processor with a minimum of 8 gigabytes RAM, which is fairly low, and a GTX 630, which is very low or equivalent. Although noticeably they are still promoting an NVIDIA graphics card on Linux. Terraria has hit over 60 million sales, with Terraria 1.4.5 shaping up to be another big update. Yeah, I don't imagine I will personally ever get around to playing Terraria, but clearly I own it, and overall people are very overwhelmingly positive about it. The Windows to Linux compatibility layer Wine, which is not an emulator. Wine is not an emulator, is what Wine backronyms into. Or I don't think backronym is even the right word when you're self-referencing yourself that way. Version 10.0 is planned for a mid-January 2025 release. Improved Unicode, improved Wayland support, lots of direct play support upgrades, new Media Foundation backend using FFmpeg, ARM64 support upgrades, initial driver store implementation, expanded support for ODBC Windows drivers. I don't know what ODBC is. Yeah. I recognize that acronym or something like it. I remember very roughly for like infrared connection or connecting to a car. ODB would be, or OBD, onboard dashboard connection. Yeah, I don't think it's connecting to a car. Support for elevating processor privileges, better dvorak keyboard detection, and much more. Now, inherently it is important to point out that if Wine comes out with a new version that eventually tunnels its way down to forks of Wine like Proton, which then means Proton will eventually get all of this improved code, assuming Proton determines that this improved code is good and needed. And a big major number improvement does imply that they feel like this is a big change. Here's the story I talked about before. Linux has hit exactly 2% user share on the October Steam surveys, hardware and software survey, which puts Windows at 96.61%, down 0.23%, Linux up 0.13%, and in macOS also going up 0.1%, which yeah, that's a big deal. Certainly to see Windows going down. They get into more details, pointing out that the English language share overall went up 8.09%, with simplified Chinese dropping by 1%. So that Black Myth Wukong bump is probably starting to fall a little bit down. The Chinese version of Steam and what you can buy on Steam in China is an incredibly small number of games compared to the tens of thousands of games on the global version of Steam. Then SteamOS went down actually as far as Linux operating systems this month by 2.41%, which perhaps highlights that there is not that much enthusiasm this month about the Steam Deck since nothing new has happened. and then you get a boost of Arch Linux in general just going up. But yeah, I guess if I was building a new computer right now, going through the effort of installing Arch Linux might be the move, although Bazzite may very well be built into Arch Linux, so it could be that most of this Arch Linux is Bazzite or Chimera OS, which is the other operating system I couldn't remember. Free Desktop SDK is up, Ubuntu is up, Linux Mint is up, Monjaro, I don't know why you use Monjaro. Some of these do seem fairly weird to pick. Pop! OS is up quite a bit. Linux up, Linux Mint is up a little, but you can see overall Linux Mint is at the bottom of this list. It really just isn't a contender these days. I'd imagine Bazzite and Chimera OS is taking up a lot of this Arch Linux. And so you have SteamOS based on Arch Linux, and Arch Linux holding 45% of all the Linux operating systems that are running. And this free desktop says Flatpak, so I'd assume that is also based on Arch Linux. It's not until you get to the fourth spot of Ubuntu that you have a Debian based Linux in Ubuntu. Linux Mint is Ubuntu also. Linux Mint here, which is the older version. So yeah, Linux Mint newest version is still competing. So you have Debian here, Debian here, and Debian here. And then Pop! OS I think might be based off of Arch or Fedora. Really don't know. Monjaro I think is its own branch. Of course, this highlights an issue, certainly, is if you eliminate all the Linux operating systems and had a chart of just Windows and Mac OS, it would be Windows has probably 98% of all this operating systems excluding Linux that are playing games, and Mac OS probably has 2% at most. Probably less than that. Well, we actually know less than that. It still very much is a Windows world for gaming. And it'll be a long time before we get from that. Of course, that deadline of Windows 10 shutting down for people who can't upgrade or don't want to upgrade to Windows 11 is coming up in a year or two. And so we probably will see some big changes on that. And if Apple cared, they should be pushing for more people to install Mac OS on their pre-built computers and their existing computers, but they don't care, and so they don't make that something you can really do. And Linux just doesn't have the money of Microsoft in general to promote itself, so it's tough to convince your average person to do Linux. Noticeably, if people are going to go to Linux, they probably still would go with just Chromebooks and buying cheap new computers to accomplish the small things they would do. And this ignores completely the fact that the vast majority of people have just given up on having computers overall and just have tablets and cell phones, which brings you back to Android, which is Linux based, sorta. It's not really Linux though, it's its own separate thing, and iOS, which is not really Mac OS, but much closer to being Mac OS than Android is to Linux. Yeah, it would be nice, I guess, if Android let you install Flatpaks or Linux software at all. They don't, though. Maybe there will be some new legal wrangling that forces Google to make Android be able to install Linux packages. That would be weird, certainly, but that could open up a lot of open source already developed Linux programs to make versions for cell phones. Apparently DayZ works really nicely on Linux now, according to Gaming on Linux. The Thing Remastered has been Steam Deck verified ahead of release. And you can check out the new trailer. This is a remaster release of an older game. The 4X Grand Strategy game Imperium Greek Wars adds full Proton and Steam Deck support. A lot of these articles are going to be, this game now works on Steam Deck. New games to claim with Prime Gaming for November 1st edition is also available. Which, yes, you can claim these games, but none of them are going to be in the Steam Deck. So, it is very much a different audience that would grab these games to play them on their Linux operating system. Although there probably is a large amount of overlap between people who don't want the DRM of Steam and people who run Linux operating systems. You can get the complete collection of Generation 0 and DLC in the Humble Bundle. And yeah, that too. You can see this is going kind of long today, and that too is just kind of more of an advertisement, generic advertisement. Suleco gets a special campaign mode beta, adding a huge new game plus. Yep. It definitely feels like Gaming on Linux by far is the game to is my one source that's actually talking about games. So here's the new AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D gaming processor being announced for release in just 3 days. Obviously I wouldn't recommend just pre-ordering them, although I guess if you needed it now you would have to, but it would make a lot more sense to wait until reviews come out. There has been a long list of duds as far as CPUs and GPUs coming out in this year, so caution is certainly advised. We won't try to get too technical, but this does sound exciting. First of all, AMD has re-engineered its 64 megabit. I assume that is level 2 cache, maybe level 1 cache memory below the processor, which means the processor now, the circuitry of the processor is going to be at a higher level on the computer chip, which means cooling the chip is going to be easier because you'll have a direct connection there to the transistors that are doing the processing and probably producing the higher amount of heat. They are claiming an average of 8% improvement over the previous generation and up to 20% faster than the Intel Core Ultra 928 285K, which the Intel CPUs lately seem to be pretty big duds. Now, it is also worth pointing out that this 9800X3D is an 8-core 16-thread up to 5.2, but its base frequency is only 4.7 gigahertz processor. It has a 104 megabits total cache. I assume that's L3, level 3 cache. I think level 1 cache is always 2 megabits, just for compatibility reasons. And it's going for a thermal watt displacement of 120 watts, which I think at this point they are trying to make CPUs go no higher than 120 watts because super power hungry, super hot CPUs aren't just really needed to be made, and it just doesn't really help. There is potentially a new generation of connections that will come out in the next 10 years where I imagine we'll see CPUs with a much bigger die size. I wouldn't be surprised if we find like CPUs that are twice as long, and maybe even the possibility that you could put 2 CPUs into a standard gaming PC, if not 4 CPUs, like servers let you do. You can have 2, sometimes 4 CPUs in server CPU type things. But yeah, even if it stays square, it's going to be bigger. It's going to have more connections. It's going to try and spread out the heat. These newest Ryzens can't even cool themselves completely, and that's why you have these little cutouts on the metal top here. It's because they're having to squeeze more resistors and circuitry on the top while also trying to cool. And so yeah, these chips, which have been fairly standard for several years now, are just too small for the amount of transistors that modern CPUs have. The other thing to point out here is that there very possibly will be other variants of the Ryzen 7 that come out. This is going to be the $500 top of the line one, but there very possibly will be binned versions of this that go up to only 5 gigahertz instead of 5.2, or only have 6 cores, although they probably are going to get away from 6 cores and go down just to 4 cores with 8 threads. And a 4-core 8-thread that still could go up to 5.2 might very well be more than fine for most gamers. Really, 8 cores is giving you just a lot of extra cores for recording your footage in OBS and things like that, if anything. Of course, if you're going at 4K or higher, you need the maximum amount of cores, but yeah, a 4-core 8-thread makes sense. An 8-core 16-thread at slower speeds makes sense. I think you could go down even as low as a base frequency of 3.5 and still probably have a decent performance if the price is right. Because yeah, the truth of the matter still is that these base frequencies are very deceptive, in that you basically need to take the 8 cores and divide it by 4.7 to get what the actual frequency for each core is running at, which, let's see, 816, 32, 48, yeah. Yeah. I think that's somewhere around 400 or 500 megahertz per core. Now, I might be wrong about what I'm saying right now, but yeah. There is a lower base frequency clock number that they're not really mentioning here. The fact that it's whole new architecture could be amazing and could be great, but it also could come with some problems. This is their Zen 5 architecture, and it's featuring the AMD Gen 3D V cache technology. So there's several branded new ways of designing things to potentially be more optimized around. Generally speaking, I would like to spend closer to $350 on a CPU instead of $500 on a CPU, because also you need to find some kind of graphics card to pair with it for the best performance. It is true though that when I run benchmarks, the CPU that I have right now, which is fairly good, performs pretty terribly on the current benchmarks compared to my graphics card. And that's usually fine, but you know, it probably should be closer together. I may very well have bought too slow of a CPU, or been too obsessed about having a lot more cores than I needed, instead of faster base frequency speeds. But yeah, generating frames via CPU in a video card benchmark is going to give you a bad performance, and it's not something that really is going to happen too much, although it actually will happen quite a bit for me using OBS and creating videos, encoding and things like that. If they call that the 7800 3DX, any slower version of that is probably going to be called the 77 something, unless that is the cheapest and the lowest quality of CPUs that they're coming out with, and then they're going to come out with even more powerful CPUs later, which, man, if that was the new minimum spec, that is quite a lot in cost and performance. GE Proton, the public, the fan-made version of Proton, version 9-17 and 9-18 are out with various upgrades. Again, you probably would only install these if you are not running SteamOS. And yeah, I guess you have to install these more than likely if you're not running SteamOS. I bet you can't install Valve's version of Proton without SteamOS, and certainly that makes more of an argument for SteamOS to open itself up more to your standard computer. But yeah, it's really hard to talk about a new CPU when you don't have an operating system to match it. Then here's the most played Steam Deck games for October, which Metaphor ReFantasio is certainly getting played a lot, particularly considering how it's not Steam Deck verified. Dragon Ball Sparking Zero, same deal. And then somehow a lot of people are playing Black Myth Wukong when it seems like it's not compatible at all. Otherwise, this does look like a subset of your consistent games and your very popular games. And this is another fanatical advertisement article, and but in general try to avoid. And then this is another Humble Bundle. Remember, Gaming on Linux opens up its articles in random order, the way it lists its articles, which is just crazy that it works that way. Alright, also, I'll say GameDeveloper.com did not work, but there's only 2 new articles anyway since the first, so I just manually opened it. It worked in a different way in the way it broke, in that it opened up a whole bunch of old articles we'd already talked about. Perhaps it's catching up, but it still didn't open up the newest articles. A Netflix game exec prepares bowl of world salad to announce a new role as VP of Generated AI for Games. This is a far too piffy headline. I did tweak everything now, so I don't think we'll see any text at the bottom of any of the links. I don't think we've seen any today. Yeah, Netflix apparently is going into generative AI for games, which I'm sure will work well. And then Radical Forge has netted £2.6 million to expand the team and launch Southfield, which this comes months after they laid off a handful of staff. And we'll just leave it at that headline. Unfortunately, I've been rambling on for quite a while, and yes, I don't really care about Yu-Gi-Oh! And it's not notifications anymore. I'm not even clicking on them. Yeah, we're just letting the list get longer and longer. So I'm gonna pause the recording and take a bathroom break, and then we'll go through all the new games on Steam. So I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. Well, good news is apparently my SwitchBot S10 Robo Vacuum Mop, Robo Mopping Vacuum, really more than a Robo Vacuum. I only really got it for the mopping. Is getting yet another update. It got a new update about 5 days ago, I'd say, which I just realized erased all of my schedules without really warning me well enough on that. They probably did put a pop-up, but I probably just ignored it. Now it is getting yet another update that it should make it Matter compatible. Unfortunately, with the current state of Matter as a smart home device, it's almost certainly just going to be treated like a light bulb with an on-off button. So you could tell it to turn on, and more than likely it will try and vacuum the entire house. Perhaps the previous update that lets you customize the settings for the entire house might help in some way there, so that it doesn't just try to vacuum the entire house based on generic settings for every single room. Like the second to latest update added that custom ability where you could say, hey, this room's floors really only need to be vacuumed, or this room's floors only need a light mopping, they don't need a lot of moisture, or this room's floors need a lot of moisture. Which, yeah, particularly since I just installed new flooring, I definitely don't want to have it go and clean with basically brand new, somewhat wood-based furniture with a lot of water and then warp it as a brand new thing. So yeah, there could be some help there, but with that custom per room custom amounts of water, between a lot of water or a little water or no water at all if you're just going to tell it to vacuum, which I have some rooms with carpet, which obviously no water needed in a carpeted wall-to-wall carpet room. That could be helpful, but yeah, I don't think Matter is going to be very helpful otherwise. I do have a Matter bridge now for the Tuya infrastructure, and I know Tuya is working to be more integrated as part of as a newer member of the Matter Alliance. So theoretically, I could integrate other smart devices with the smart mop, although I'm not sure really what it is. The main thing I would really like to integrate next, on top of just moving a lot of things to Zigbee so it's not all connected to my Wi-Fi and bringing down my Wi-Fi signal. But yeah, the next thing I'd really like to integrate is the air conditioner turning off when a door is opened, which would require my smart unlock doorknob, my deadbolt, to communicate via Matter, and my air conditioner, my Ecobee thermostat, to communicate via Matter, which there is a potential future. It may be years in the future where all of that happens, but yeah, my stupid obsession with smart homes continues. I really could see myself being like the brains behind a system integrator, system installer company. The problem there is I know that my cutting edge experimentation is not going to be for most people, and there just aren't enough rich people that would hire me. I'd be competing against companies that do more custom stuff like Control 4 installers, and yeah, it would almost certainly be a dangerous type of job where you'd have to do a lot of advertising and have a lot of money behind you just to support you. Your first install might be hundreds if not thousands of dollars worth of equipment that you would potentially need to install up front and before you even get paid back, which is true for most businesses you start. Anyways, we're supposed to be looking at all the new games on Steam. So yeah, I am a bit peeved though that my smart mop for several days now has not been mopping. I had it set to mop at 5 in the morning, so yeah, it's no real surprise that I also haven't realized it wasn't mopping. Like every day it does a light mop in the bathroom tiled floors. And really, when I say mop, it is also with a grain of salt, because it's getting the surface scrubbed, but it has no real pressure behind it. So you still very well may have to pull out a mop once a month and scrub the floors if something is stuck to it. You may very well have to pull out a mop once a month anyways to get into all the corners that it can't reach. Yeah. The rolling mop pad of the SwitchBot S10 really cannot reach the edges of the walls. There are spinning mop pads technology, but they aren't connected to a water station technology to drain and clean the rolling mop pad. What really should be the case is that the rolling mop pad should just stick out of one edge completely so that it can touch the walls, and maybe be rounded on the end to accomplish that, although being rounded on the end really wouldn't change too much. Or maybe it just needs a rotating pad to get into the corners. Should I give this a chance? Generally speaking, I say no if I can't get a good clear image of what the monster is in a horror game. And so I'm going to say no for that reason. Yeah. Just in the basics, though, I will have to admit that getting the SwitchBot S10 has massively increased the amount of cleanliness, amount of cleanings on the floor, and I assume the amount of cleanliness, and it does probably pick up 24 hours worth of dust that falls on the floor over and over again, which more than likely is keep eliminating more dust from my house. The vast majority of dust I would assume is getting caught by the air filter anyways, and I heavily question how much my central AC actually is helping or hurting as far as dust in the air, because I definitely feel like the vents are very dusty. I know they're very dusty. And so yeah, I really am of the opinion next time I install a new AC unit, hiring somebody to run dusters through all the vents at that point probably makes a lot of sense. Probably would have made a lot of sense to do that every 3 to 5 years instead of 10 years in which it hasn't happened. Yeah. The vacuum is doing about as much as it can. The general idea is that if you're kind of constantly mopping or vacuuming a floor, that your floor will be more electrostatically charged to attract dust particles to the ground and pull it down. So ironically, the more you clean your floors, the more dust and dirt they will attract out of the air. But the reality is you want it out of the air, not in your lungs breathing it. And yeah, we're burning through all these games and I don't really have anything else. It does really suck how my attention and excitement is much more around smart devices in the past couple of years than video games. Although I did front load my excitement around Torchlight 2, or my review around Torchlight 2 at the beginning of this stream, which has pushed me to be at the 2 hours and 30-minute mark once again. Some of this, the reason why these streams might be going longer, may very also well be because we are just getting more games being released, more bits of news happening. May very well finally be moving away from the yeah, we may finally, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, we may finally be getting video game news for real now, which is making the streams longer. Interesting, we have a whole another, just in the middle here, GameDeveloper.com article. Apparently they weren't very good. Pandemic has halted development of the Playdate stereo dock. Making the stereo dock was almost more challenging than making the Playdate itself. Interesting. We have not gotten any good news around the Playdate in a very long time, so pretty much since launch. It's been a kind of ridiculous product, and I don't know what more you could add to it to make it feel like it's anything more than a gimmick, and having a stereo dock definitely makes it feel just more like a gimmick. Now, at a certain level, I could see having a sharp LCD screen, which from what I hear are actually fairly high quality, on a stereo dock, Bluetooth type dock that could maybe play radio also, which is what I would assume this is an antenna for. But you don't need a D-pad, you don't need an A/B button, and you don't need a dial for any of that. And there is a Kickstarter project I just saw that does kind of an interesting twist on something like this, in that it takes effectively a radio unit, a head unit from a car LCD screen with the Android Auto and CarPlay operating system stuff, and it just puts a battery pack on it, puts it in what is a 3D printed case almost certainly, and puts some Bluetooth speaker functionality and speakers into it. And then you have this waterproof case where it's a mobile media player, potentially making a resurgence, but with a whole new operating system, in that it would be exactly, or it's very similar to what new cars, Android Auto cars, would have. It still has some problems though, certainly, because it's just not really being built for what it was intended to be used for. So having to either Wi-Fi connect or plug into it with your phone, that way you can listen to Audible and Spotify and things like that from your phone's CPU, seems kind of ridiculous. The whole thing seems like a fairly big thing. It being battery run so it can be in a waterproof case is a weird thing. But yeah, it's a thought. Although not really a good thought, because you could certainly just have a Bluetooth speaker in your bathroom and that'll accomplish most of what a car radio unit could accomplish. You're spending far too much time in the shower if you're actually touching on a touch screen and selecting different audio. Mostly what you want in a Bluetooth speaker in the bathroom too is, on top of it being waterproof, it being loud. So a wired Bluetooth speaker, which you can get those on exhaust vents is just add a Bluetooth speaker to a light in the ceiling or an exhaust vent with a light into the ceiling. Makes a lot more sense than having the extra functionality to fiddle with in the shower. Unless, of course, you're trying to look at porn in the shower, which I hadn't thought of that, but I guess if you need video porn in the shower, that's one thing it would probably work very well for, assuming you can bring up whatever porn site and play it on a car radio unit. Yeah, that probably is really what it's for. But it was an interesting thing Facebook advertised to me as a Kickstarter. Way more interesting than this yellow brick that this screenshot doesn't even show. I don't know what Playdate really could do to get back to talking about video games, which this is barely connected to video games and really just a gimmick product. I think they would just need to go back to the drawing board, see if they can make something fairly cheap that is basically just a Game Boy clone, because the spinning here, the sharp screen, those sales pitches didn't really work. So just coming out with something called the Playdate 2 that can play NES games, that has like a Famiclone chip in it to emulate ROMs and things like that. A bigger screen, better screen, a better form factor. That would all make sense. Probably would dive deep into the STEM aspects and the programming aspects and try and sell it to parents as a device that kids could program their own games for, which is kind of what they tried to do with Playdate. It didn't succeed. But mostly if I was panic, I would panic and shut down. That would be my decision. I would have never started a business making the Playdate as a piece of hardware in the first place. And if I was going to make the Playdate, the graphics all glitched there for a second. I can't make it do it again. I'd probably start in the software department. I would make a company that is known for making tiny little pieces of games first. Then, once I had established some brand loyalty, I would have come out with a Playdate piece of hardware. Here's another game with Hitler in the name. It still seems very ridiculous that Valve doesn't just ban all games with Hitler in the name. It's kind of ridiculous. Is this game worth talking about? Maybe. I'll make a YouTube short on it, but I won't put it on the follow list. This Madness Arena almost looks good enough to give it a chance. I'll give it a chance. It's probably just an asset flip game. We have hit a point where even the asset flip games feel fairly low effort. Far too many cat games. Far too many match games. This is like a card matching game, but it's tagged as a Sokoban box pushing game. That does not look like what that is. We're getting like the same games 2 in a row, it seems. We are still seeing more Japanese looking games, although in this case it only supports the English language, so I assume this actually isn't made by a Japanese company. We also are seeing more Japanese language only games on rare occasion. But yeah, Christmas isn't that big of an holiday in Asian countries. So it'd be kind of crazy. Here's another adult game that's not getting curated. I'm still not sure why that's the case. Yeah, I worked very hard to make sure that that wasn't the case, and it's something about how these games are getting curated where it's skipping over a few. And perhaps maybe I need to redo how the code works to make sure that it doesn't happen. And yeah, we're still getting a lot of adult games that are in the they're kind of not being put in the right section of the Steam storefront. Guess this is version 1.0. Still not really getting a ton of high quality games. We never do. And that can be somewhat wearing on me in particular, is that day to day we try to look at every single new game that comes out, and the truth is that 99.9% of them are absolute garbage. This is probably nothing, this Goat Massacre, but at least it is kind of creative. Of course, I can't really call for censorship or curation around the Steam storefront. As a free speech believer, free speech advocate, as I like to describe myself. Plus, I can't personally even define relevancy in my own mind, let alone trying to apply any kind of standard to anybody else. Yeah. At best, I could create a cruel system that would delist games after a certain amount of time if they don't have a certain amount of this is just online PvP but with no in-app purchases. Interesting. Are you actually playing a poker worth playing? No, this is not your standard poker game. It's different. It's not Texas Hold'em for sure. You're switching cards with other players. Moai Land, if it was better animated, I might have given it a chance. Yeah, at best I can make a cruel system where if a game doesn't make a certain amount of money, then you would have to repay to continue to list your game on Steam. Otherwise, just make it $100 per year that your game is listed on Steam, and that would clean up a lot of Steam in the long run. And then perhaps over a longer period of time, a lot of the low effort asset flip people would say, well, I'm not really expecting to make $100 on this game in 365 days. I was hoping to make maybe $100 back over the course of a year. Of course, a lot of the chancers that are putting their games on Steam probably do really believe that they will make some profits. This looks like this might actually be decent, although really it's just that one screenshot and then everything else is pretty bad. Yeah, I think a lot of chancers do, and certainly there's no telling how many people just straight up run up credit cards or use stolen accounts to stolen credit cards or things like that to list their games on Steam. If just now Linux has just recently kicked out Russian maintainers from the Linux kernel project, that really probably speaks to just how slow a lot of companies around the world that have legal requirements by their countries to not deal with Russian, how slow they've been. Yeah, there's all kinds of legal embargoes. In a lot of cases, it seems like the story was that the maintainers they kicked out of being contributors to the Linux kernel were working for Russian-based companies and had them listed as their employer. So they may not even have been Russian people, which, you know, the laws probably differ greatly. Oh, here's another horror game that actually looks pretty decent. And yeah, as much as I might complain about there not being much here, I have to still admit that there's about 60 tabs of games to make YouTube shorts on that I just made. So yeah, there's still a lot go on. Also, before we wrap up, wanted to highlight that THQ Nordic retweeted this First Four Figures company that has a Fury pre-orders opening up in 8 days. So once again, they're trying to promote Fury. The figure looks nice. It's probably way too expensive if I was to guess. Here they have non-branded soda cans just to show you how big it is, which that is very large. This is probably a $200 or $300 figurine when all is said and done, but it does give you the ability to have fairly high amounts of detail. The picture itself is not that detailed, but I would say Fury not my favorite of the Darksiders characters. Seems like this company either has a lot of licenses to a lot of different things, which is very believable, video game related, or they're just really good. Look how giant this Sonic one is. The question here is, whose shelf is that big, though? I mean, assuming this is an average sized human's head and this is an average sized human's hand, you're talking 2.5 heads from the peak here, and from this peak here to this, you're talking probably 3 heads worth. This would not fit on a standard bookcase. You'd have to put it on top of a bookcase, and even at that, if you had a tall bookcase, it more than likely would be scraping the top of the roof of your ceiling. Yeah. And the expense for these niche items is gonna be huge. And yes, while I do have some anime waifu type figurines, Figmas, I got them extremely cheap on my shelves. They're very small. They are about the exact same size as a DVD case, and they are nice little cheap decorations in the same theme. Whereas if I was to have a bookshelf full of physical games, the games themselves wouldn't be that interesting, and these kinds of statues would just dominate over them. And that inherently is the problem with almost all of these collectible figurines around video games, is that you're taking a nicely animated 3D model in most cases in video games and then transforming it and transitioning it into a real world display. And that's just asking quite a lot, certainly, for that to make sense and be something worth doing. And it definitely is for the Uber fans. Like, it definitely is not for your average person. And inherently, I would assume that a large percentage of people who have these kinds of statues have multiple of them and are more just addicted to buying decorations than being a real super fan of any of the games. Like, I love Bayonetta 1. I have no use whatsoever to have Bayonetta's gun, one of Bayonetta's guns, on my shelf. Noticeably, they are picking games that do have a fairly passionate fandom. I think there's far too passionate of fandom around Animal Crossing. These are only 10 inches tall though, so that is much more reasonable. Here's a Sonic Adventure. In comparison, it's just not even at the same scale. And scale definitely is going to become a thing when you start to think about different statues. Because if you're going to put multiple statues on display, it would be ridiculous for one to be giant and the next to be tiny. And yeah. And this isn't even like memorabilia. Interesting, there's a whole book here. I just jumped to them promoting one of their artists who has a graphic novel. It's not nostalgia stuff, though, when you get down to it, because the kind of Nintendo toys you might have bought as a kid are going to be much cheaper, smaller, more breakable products. They're going to be the McDonald's toys that came out for Super Mario Brothers 3, I think, and things like that. They're not going to be $200, $300, $400 statues, and these statues are never really reminiscent of a higher quality version of things you might actually be nostalgic for. I mean, very little time to be nostalgic for Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild. I don't know who really wants Pyramid Head on their screen. I could see if you were a huge fan of Cowboy Bebop, having Ed here might make a little sense, but probably not for the price. It would make a lot more sense just to have the DVDs of Cowboy Bebop and watch it one more time, or buy it a second time, which is not unheard of. Buying a DVD version, buying a Blu-ray, buying a 4K. Here you have just a bust, which allows more detail. They definitely are promoting the same things over and over again. And these don't sell in any kind of big numbers. That's why you don't see a lot of game companies really promote them too much. They are just things that would be included in those highly expensive collector's edition at best, or put on a eShop on a video game storefront that I imagine sells very little. This is one of the bad guy creatures from the anime Berserk. Some of these I don't even recognize. Yeah, you're getting this weird occasional anime and then mostly video game statues. I imagine it is a case where the real money that's made here by THQ Nordic is that they just sell the license and then don't really pay any attention to what the statues makers make, because they get that licensing fee and they probably get almost nothing per sale, if not nothing per sale. That's thunder outside. Yeah, I knew it was going to be stormy. So yeah, I could continue to scroll down here probably forever, but there's just not enough variety here. And so yeah, on that, that's going to be it for this stream. I dropped exactly 0 frames. I'm not super happy with the kilobits per second, but I'll go back and look at the video quality and see what it looks like. I think I may have just tweaked things to be better, and I may just slowly try to bring up the kilobits per second overall. But yeah, maybe my internet fixed itself, or maybe I changed something that I shouldn't have changed. Anyways, that's going to be it for this stream. As always, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and keep on watching. Thanks.